Welcome back to the Exceptional Sales Leader podcast, and welcome to a man coming in the evening. In the evening, and this is being recorded. This is in the first week of July. It's actually at his dinner, so he's looking very resplendent in his beautiful pink. Is that that's a polo shirt, right?
It is. Yes, it is a polo
Magnificent
shirt.
polo shirt coming in from Philadelphia. Mr. Keith Willis, welcome to the Exceptional Sales Leader podcast.
Thank you, Darren. Really excited to be here. Glad I was able to make it today. I know we had some challenges there coming from dinner, but after listening to a few episodes, just happy to be here and looking forward to our conversation.
Yeah, thank you. And I do apologize because there was and I think we were talking just before you pressed record. Uh you were talking about having a virtual assistant that has been relieved of their duties of making some decisions. Because I got a decline, then I got an acceptance, and then I got an email overnight. So yeah, I'm ready to go. And so we made this happen really quickly. So greatly appreciate it. Hey, you're the founder and president of Core Management Training. You've got a lot of experience around leadership, pharma sales, but also interestingly a military background as well. I'm really looking forward to this conversation because it could go anywhere, but I think just based on our little preamble before we press record, there's some really cool points that people listening to this can really bring home to roost and help them in their sales leadership journey. Mate, before we jump into it, I'd love to always get a bit of a sense of my guest's background in terms of what you've done and what's led you to now do what you do with core management training.
So yeah, Darren, I started out as a ROTC cadet. I 4 years of college and graduated with a regular Army commission. The same day I graduated from college, I got my commission all on the same day.
Wow.
Went to my officer basic course and landed in Germany. So I was in Germany for 3 years, did a variety of roles. The Probably one of the most important roles as a young lieutenant as a platoon leader. So I had two different platoon leader roles. I was in a ordnance unit. So what a lot of people don't realize when we think of ordnance, we think of explosive bombs and all of those things. At least in the States, that's the smallest part of the ordnance corps. So you have missile
Okay.
management, you have automotive management, and then you have explosive ordnance. Now, obviously, this was before the Gulf War, so that may have changed now.
Right.
But when
Okay.
I was in, it was automotive maintenance. So we had responsibility for fixing vehicles. I was automotive platoon leader as well as at one point in time what they call the E&E electronic and engineering platoon. And then eventually I became what they call the shop officer. So just think in terms of you're going to get your car fixed
Mm,
and you drop your car off to the shop. My team had responsibility for getting those
right.
vehicles fixed. And then if
Okay.
those vehicles weren't fixed, there were issues, obviously, because units needed to have a certain percentage of the vehicles ready to roll so that they could be mission capable.
Mm,
So did that, and then I came back stateside around that time, the first Gulf War. So I had responsibility for making sure seeing all the vehicles painted that went off to the desert, and then eventually became what they call the S1. So think in terms of the S1 as the administrative officer or HR for all practical purposes.
okay.
We had about 900 soldiers in our battalion. We had some of the last couple of units coming back from Southwest Asia, and then we had a unit relocating from Germany. So I had a responsibility for whether it be pay, officer evaluations, NCO evaluations, anything to do with any type of HR type of issues, I had a responsibility for.
Mm,
And then decided that I was going to get out. So worked through a junior military recruiter and ended up in sales. And so it was interesting because, like a lot of people, I never thought I was going to be a salesperson. But in fact, I had never even seen or even heard of a pharmaceutical rep. And I had a couple of interviews. And, back in the day when you interviewed for a pharmaceutical job, you used to have the opportunity to spend the day in the field with the sales representative. I
yeah.
didn't have that opportunity.
Okay.
And my first day in the field was the first time I got a sense of, oh, this is what a rep does. I don't know if I would have signed up for it then, but I was fortunate. I had some good mentors and some folks that helped me out. So I would say that the guy that interviewed me did a good job of selling me because he equated being in pharmaceutical sales like being in the military. So he talked about sales forces as in units, putting promotional messaging against certain products and those type of things. So I got that analogy, and so that was how I ended up in pharmaceutical sales, moving
Man.
from the military. So big jump, big change.
And I love to explore because you mentioned before you never thought you'd be in sales, and it's interesting. The vast majority of people I speak to, whether it be on this podcast or just generally in business, it's almost none of them have actually woken up one day and said, "Yep, I reckon I'll be in sales. I reckon that's a good career to proceed with." It's always been, well, I kind of fell into that, or in some people say that's the only role I could get, so I thought I'd give it a crack. Um, and so fast forwarding to that, we'll talk about what you've learned through your career in sales and now what you do now, but love to know making that transition from the military where it was very structured and you're looking after all of those people in terms of all the administration, the HR related stuff. Making that transition into private enterprise and into a sales role where you're now responsible. What were some of the key lessons from, I guess, your leadership background within the military that helped you make that transition? Presupposing, of course, it was a relatively smooth transition. I'm sure there would have been some bumps in the road, but looking back in that transition, what are some of the key lessons that helped you transition into a sales and then eventually into the leadership roles?
I think the big thing is that in the military as an officer, you have a great deal of responsibility. I mean, when I got out of the military, I was what, 28 maybe
Hmm.
after 6 years. So even at 21 or 22 years old, my first platoon had, I think, 70 soldiers. And then the automotive platoon had 40 soldiers, and then responsibility for running a shop with close to 200 soldiers, 7 or 8 direct reports. So you go from being, I wouldn't say king of the hill, but all of a sudden you're just responsible for yourself. And
Yeah.
I do think the first rule of leadership is you have to lead yourself ultimately.
Yeah.
And so I had learned a lot of those lessons in the military, because not only do you have responsibility for soldiers, you also have responsibility for yourself. And things like, you're doing PT 2 or 3 times a week, you pass the PT test, you have to carry yourself in a certain way. Being overseas in Germany, you stand out because you're American relatively to being in Germany. And so a lot of eyes are on you, and you're working with other allies, other units. You have customers. I had customers.
Mm.
We called them customers when we fix vehicles, those type of things. So you had
Yeah.
customer units, and you treated them as such. You go from that to all of a sudden it's just you as a salesperson. You just have to get up and you have to figure out, how do I sell? What is the selling thing that I need to learn how to do? You go from fixing vehicles or managing a deadline list to, how do I learn this product? How do I sell that? And so there's a level of study, and you have to swallow your pride, because in the pharmaceutical industry, the sales rep position is entry level. Now, for some
Mm.
people, they spend a career as sales representative, but even their CEOs, a lot of CEOs carried a bag as a sales representative back in the day. So it is
Yeah.
a great training ground. And ultimately it comes down to learning how to manage yourself, manage your emotions.
Mm.
As an officer, you're standing in front of soldiers, and at times things aren't going great. You have to learn how to control your emotions and those type of things. And when I was younger, my emotional intelligence probably wasn't that great. And over years, as you get older and wiser and more mature, you get better at doing those things. But as a sales representative, when you're going in to see physicians, you're talking to nurses, you're talking to staff every day, ultimately it's the relationships that you develop in these offices. And
Mm.
you have a rotation, so you may have anywhere from 120 doctors that you're seeing from every 4 to 6 weeks. So that relationship and your selling skills make the difference between getting your product written and not written. So a lot of lessons there. And part of it's, swallowing your pride and knowing how to ask for help.
Well, it's and thanks for sharing that. It's interesting as you were talking, I was just reflecting on some of my own clients that I've worked with as a mentor and as a coach who have been in the pharmaceutical industry or the medical industry where it's very specialized knowledge. And particularly when you've got clients who are doctors, physicians, cardiovascular surgeons, orthopedic surgeons, etc., the expectations they have on a person who is coming in to sell them a solution to a problem is really, really high. You also mentioned the importance of mentors as well in your journey. From a person coming from a military background and, for want of a better term, being thrust into pharmaceutical sales, how was I guess, the onboarding process with you? So you mentioning you had a cycle of physicians to talk to with over a period of, say, 6 weeks or so. How did you go about building credibility in the eyes of those physicians to the point where they would even start to contemplate the solutions that you were providing them? Because this is a really interesting point, because you've got to establish credibility as a sales leader, and you've got to establish credibility as a salesperson or sales professional before the customers even contemplate thinking about your solution. Is there anything specific that you did?
I think ultimately you have to show up. I think that's part of the piece. I spent my first couple of years, I was fortunate to work. We kind of worked in a team perspective. You had your own territory. We crossed over products. And there were a couple of people that were on my team that they won sales awards almost every year. In fact, one of my first district managers, he had been a rep for over 20 years when he became a district manager. He was a new district manager, and even now is probably one of the best district managers that I had.
Yeah.
He intuitively knew what you needed to do, and I remember, you got a diamond, so he had this shamrock ring, and he had four diamonds and a ruby, and that was representative of all the awards that he had won. And I remember I used to always say, "Yeah, I want to get one of those. I want to get one of those awards and wear one of those rings." And he was a no nonsense, pretty straightforward. I remember my car looking like a disaster, and him telling me, "If the next time I ride with you, if your car looks like that, there are going to be some consequences." And he gave me the reason why. We're professional. You don't know who's going to see your car. You're representing the organization and those type of things. So
Yeah.
I appreciated his straightforward demeanor. So having those type of conversations with managers is really important. And when I was a rep, training was pretty rigorous. The company that I worked, there was I can't remember, but I think it was like a 4-week training cycle, and you spent a lot more time in training then than you did now.
Yeah.
And you had to pass exams. And I think 2 years in, they had what they call a medical review exam, and that exam was 200 questions. And if you passed the exam, the good news was you got a 10% raise. They don't give 10% raises anymore. If you didn't pass the exam, you probably should put your resume together and start looking for a job. But they had vetted that with physicians, and what the feedback was is that exam was on the level of what a medical student would get.
Right.
And so you build up your product knowledge, and then when you go in, you can answer questions, you talk to the physician, you build relationships. I always think of the trust equation. So you
Hmm.
mentioned the credibility piece, which is one part of that. Uh, do you do what you say you're going to do? Do you show up? Then there's the competency piece.
Mm.
Then it's the intimacy, which comes back to the relationship divided by your self-orientation. And
Yeah.
interesting enough, the more self-orientation that you have, the less trust that you have in the office. So I often like to think in terms of, when you think about building trust in whether it's with customers, internally, even with family, to think about the trust equation. So if you have
Mm.
all of those components, as you build trust, it gives you a lot more autonomy. It builds your credibility. It gives you the opportunity to be able to serve your customers.
It's it's huge. I often use the trust equation in my workshops for leaders, and I do a little trust game afterwards, and it's interesting how competitive people get and how self-orientation comes to the surface. Even though intellectualize, yeah, yeah, it's not about us, it's all about serving the team, until there's a competition. I've got to win. I've got to win. So you then made the leap after a few years into a district manager role and a sales leadership role. Love your experience on reflection, moving from being an individual contributor to a sales leader, and how easy or difficult was that for you?
The truth of the matter was, I was not a great district manager by any stretch of the imagination. And it was interesting going from, because in the military, there's an assumption. So there clearly is structure. I remember my commander used to say, "You have hours like a banker." I mean, as an officer, you do run your mission. There's expectation of you saw problems, you don't bring problems to me, and so there's far more autonomy as an officer than people realize. And I probably I talked about this whole emotional immaturity
Yeah.
younger, the stuff you just do, stupid stuff I think back on. You lose your temper, you yell at people and things like that. And you can kind of get away with that in the military, even though on reflection, the better leaders were those that were calm, cool, and collected. The people that were respected the most were the leaders that didn't need to raise their voice, that listened to problems, that help people do things. And over time, as you get older, or at least for me, I can't speak for everybody. As
Mm.
as as I matured, I began to realize there are some things that I needed to do more effectively. But as a district manager, the first couple of years were tough, and looking back at it, I would say that I should have waited longer.
Okay.
I had been a sales representative at that point with two different companies. The first company I ended up leaving because of downsizings and those type of things. And when I went over to the next company, I won two district rep of the year. I finished 3 out of 640 sales representatives. So I had street cred from the standpoint of being able to sell effectively, and
Yeah.
we had a good development program as far as preparing people to be managers. But you can train people all day long, but until you do the job, I joke with people that don't want to be a manager, and I say, you'll learn. It's one of the most developmental jobs that you get. All of the lessons and things that you need to learn, you'll learn as a district manager. If you have a gap, that's going to be the thing that you have an
That's
opportunity to
right.
work on as a manager. So that was my experience, and on the back end of it, I did I did better. So there were some reps I managed well. I had great relationships with, and then there are reps that I struggled with. I would say they were middle performers. Middle performers in that they weren't looking to get promoted. They would tell you they wanted to get promoted, but they weren't looking to get promoted because
Mm.
when I look at them now, some of them are still in the industry,
Yeah.
still in sales. And interesting enough, a lot of them put up great numbers.
Yeah. Okay.
They would be way over goal. It wasn't a matter of that. It's just they're not raising their hand to volunteer. They're not trying to do anything extra. And they would be a pain in your backside. You might call them on a Friday afternoon and it's like they're in the office doing expense reports
Yeah.
because they're trying to get down to the shore. And I was one, this is like expectation is you should be out working. And I had to learn, look, if you're putting up the numbers, you get a little bit more autonomy versus if you're not. And it was all of those things learning how to work through. And interesting enough, it wasn't until I left and I went to another organization that had a very, very strong leadership development program. And it wasn't that the company that I was at before didn't. It was
Mm.
just a way that the guy that ran the program, he was a guru. There was no debate whether you're first or second line leader. You were coming to his training, and then there were two levels. So as a second line leader, there would be coaching, or they would listen to sessions where you coached your first line leader, and there would be feedback on the coaching, and then there would be feedback for the first line leader who was coaching their representative. So
Yeah.
up the chain there was an opportunity to see, and because I was in training and then as a part of the cadre and going through all the different rotations and training the classes, you begin to learn how to be more effective as a leader, and then
Mm.
running training teams internally, I became a much better leader. So I think it's a combination of time. There's always a time element. There's a maturity element. There are parts of us that, maybe from a business perspective, you may be very strong, but you may not have the emotional maturity. For some people, they're emotionally mature very early. Maybe the
Mm.
business acumen is not that good. So we all have stuff to work on.
Yeah.
But I would say that was my journey, and I was fortunate because I was in organizations where there was a lot of leadership training, and unfortunately, I would say that in the pharma industry, that's not as consistent now as it has been in the past. And part of it is because there are more downsizings, there are more cutbacks, there are more companies that are being bought. So all of those things it becomes difficult to justify how do we sustain a leadership development program if the people that go through the program aren't going to get promoted.
Yeah, true, true. So would you say that that's one of the key challenges facing a lot of organizations now, particularly in the sciences and pharma industry?
I definitely would say that's a challenge. How do you get the next group of people ready to get promoted?
Mm,
I think it goes. I think this is probably every industry. I don't think
mm,
it's unique to pharma. Pharma, we joke and we say the industry's gotten old. It hasn't. It hasn't. There's a life cycle. When I started, I was in my late 20s. A lot of us were the same age. A lot of people I know now are retiring. Some of them are
yeah.
CEOs. Some of them have done extremely well in the career. And it used to be you'd hire people that didn't have a lot of sales experience.
Yeah.
And now, because you have a lot more specialty drugs, more specialty products, there's a tendency to hire representatives that have experience. So it's harder for people to break in.
Mm,
And the other part of that is that when you're trying to figure out how do I create a developmental pipeline, what's that going to look like? I will often hear, well, we're not expanding, we're not going to have new promotions. And so how do I train people? How do I get them ready to step into these roles? So
mm,
it's not unheard of where you talk to leadership and people feel like people aren't ready. And I even talk to second line leaders that uh, have had training and they'll say, I don't know that I'm as prepared as I need to be to how to coach my first line leader or how to
yeah.
coach their people,
Yeah.
provide feedback. So I think it's a challenge in budgets, money, time. I don't know if you remember back in the day when I was a rep, we used to get mail once a week, and you'd wait for the mail to come in and you go through the mail. Now you get that much mail in 15 minutes on your
Yeah.
computer.
That's
So
it.
the tempo's so much faster now, and the expectations are so much higher now than they were 20 years ago.
They are. They are, which we kind of, as you were talking about the second level leaders and even the first line leaders there, um, my experience is a lot of leaders are thrust into a leadership position because they've been a great individual contributor, and that seems to be the catalyst or the trigger for them to be given the opportunity. And I know you talk a little bit about heroic leaders to servant leaders, and I'm big on servant leadership in terms of what that, particularly in sales, which might sound a little bit counterintuitive. What do you see in the industry right now in relation to organizations where there's a lot of changes, there's a lot of maybe downsizing, changing in terms of company structures, buyouts and stuff like that? Is there still a focus on the importance of leadership and getting the right people for the future of the business, or is it more a case of we just got to get the number because we've got to make sure that we are surviving firstly, and then potentially thriving so that we can be bought out by a bigger company.
We used to joke, a friend of mine, that we were surprised our companies would run because it was more inertia and things would get going and they would just run. I think it's a combination of both. I think everybody acknowledges that there's a need for leadership. The question is how do we get people ready for leadership? And then I think there's a split because you have companies that have been around for a while, but what happens is that product goes generic, something happens, they get rid of the entire commercial team.
Yeah.
And some companies take a different approach. They move that talent around to other business units. You have to learn the product, but ultimately, business is business. You can figure that out. And then I think that there's just not enough, or there are sections of time. Last year I went to a conference and I can't remember the numbers, and it wasn't just pharma, but a lot of organizations. There was a ratio where they had cut the leadership development trainers to leaders significantly, and it'll be interesting because the conference is coming up in a couple of weeks to see where they are. But
Mm,
companies that had established leadership development programs and they were presenting what they had done with cohorts and everything, where most of the team had disappeared.
yeah.
So now you have one or two trainers responsible. And so that speaks volumes oftentimes about what a company really thinks about leadership. So even though they say the right thing, they don't necessarily believe the right thing.
Mm,
Or I'll have conversations with organizations and everybody's doing the same thing. the grow model. And it's okay. So the grow model is not that it's not effective, but everybody's doing it.
Yeah.
Situational leadership, SBI. I mean, there's all of this stuff. And then you ask the question, okay, so what problem are you trying to solve? So they'll do a whole overhaul of leadership development, but they don't answer the question of, well, what's the problem we're trying to solve? What is it the program wasn't giving us that we're looking for today? And so there's all of this stuff. And I at times think and feel like that people feel like the leadership development that they're getting isn't helping them with the day to day. It's not
Mm.
helping them with some of the challenges, issues, and problems that they're having with their teams. How do I get even the A performer today can easily be a B performer tomorrow, or even a C performer when we talk
Yeah.
about things like AI, different types of the new CRM platforms, different things that expectations that people have, it can change so quickly. So how do
Mm.
you get people through that? How do you enable them? How do you upskill them? And so I don't know that anybody has a good answer, and I don't know that a lot of organizations spend enough time figuring that out. And then I think ultimately, how do you measure what you're doing and that it's having impact? How do you really know that a sales leader that went through a curriculum and got developed is doing a good job? What does that look like?
Yeah, it's difficult because a lot of my clients, they're always talking about what's the return on investment, and it's almost like the answer to that is, well, how long's a piece of string? Because you can say, well, okay, we take you through a curriculum and we should see an uptake in customer retention, customer engagement, bottom line, top line revenue, profitability, et cetera, but often it's the observable behaviors that's the real return on investment, because if you see a sales leader having a conversation, or having a conversation with maybe a sales director, if they can be observed, that's the real return on investment, because you can see the behavioral change. What's the challenge there is it's really difficult to put a tangible number against that, because it's hard to look at a scoreboard from that. Well, what does that actually mean?
Yeah.
It's difficult, right? But and I think a lot of companies now are trying too hard to try to put some numbers against some things that perhaps it's hard to put numbers against, and
Yeah.
that's my challenge, that I'm sort of grappling with a lot of companies in Australia right now. Um, so you mentioned something there also around the A's, the B's, and the C's performers. As you know, Australia, for most companies in Australia, we've just come off the end of the financial year. So June 30 in Australia for many companies is the end of the financial year. So I know up until Monday this week, there were companies all over Australia just pounding the pavements trying to get as many sales in as possible and bringing things in from the first quarter of 2026 to this one. And now we're in the new financial year, and then we're thinking, oh, now what? What are we going to do now? um, I wanted to talk about the three tiers of performers: the low performers, top performers, but also this core middle performers, because I know you do a lot of work in this middle performance part. Um, what's your thoughts around the way that organizations and sales leaders in particular treat those three categories? And what are some opportunities that perhaps they might be missing by ignoring the middle performers?
Yeah, let's start with what the opportunity is in the middle. When you look at the middle, they represent anywhere from 60 to 70% of the sales force.
Yeah.
When you look at the top 10%, how much more are you going to get out of them?
Mm,
Probably not much more. The bottom 10, 15%, managers trying to get rid of them. You got a limited amount of time. In most organizations, and particularly in pharma, everybody gets generally the same amount of time in the field.
yeah.
If a manager spends 100 days in the field with representatives, and he or she has 10 representatives, that's about 10 days. And when you think about field input teams, special assignments, uh you're going to help with a sales meeting, your top performers are the ones that are usually tapped on the shoulder. And there's some equity and there's some learning that goes from being able to prepare for a sales meeting. You're leading a discussion, you're having an opportunity to get some exposure to marketing, sales leadership. You have an opportunity to give your input into what's going on, so you get development that way.
Mm.
If you're on the bottom, you're getting attention just because your sales stink and everybody's trying to get rid of you as quickly as possible. If you have an extra day, where's a manager going to spend it? They they might spend it with the top representative. They're probably not going to spend it with a middle representative. So the middle representative gets no feedback. No one's cheering for them,
Mm.
and they're just there. And so if you haven't said an interesting thing is in some cases these middle performers may be pretty solid sales representatives. They may be more north of 100%
Yeah.
we talk about goal attainment. It's a lot of it is around behaviors and some of the things. I mean, I think part of it is you got to agree as an organization. When we say B, what does that mean? And if you're in that category of B's, you get treated as such. There's and there's three degradations of that. There's the the top part of the B's, and then there's the middle B's, and then those B's that are they're closer to C's, and you're wondering in the back of your mind, should I be starting to think about taking some
Yeah.
action on them? So when you think about it from that perspective, it's your greatest opportunity. I was in a region where the regional manager ultimately was fired and brought in a new regional director, and we would do this thing. She called it blue skies, and the way she said was, well, we had 80 territories, and it was the cutoff. It was a number of territories that would take to hit goal. So in other words, if let's say if it were 30 territories, that it was 30 territories, and then the rest of the region would make goal. So when I was a district manager, I used to think in terms of this was kind of the Pareto principle, the 80-20 rule, where
Yeah.
and my manager would look at, do we have an A, B, or C performer? And if we don't have the right person, do we need to remove that person?
Yeah.
But the piece that I missed is that the entire management team would go down to a district, and the whole team would spend the entire day with a sales team. So every representative would ride with a sales manager or a regional training manager, and depending on how we were geographically dispersed, we would have a best practices dinner. So it might
Mhm.
be one dinner, it could be two or three dinners, and then we would get all of the different best practices and those type of things. So the piece that I missed was that it really was focused on the middle performer, because when you look at the entire region, or if you look at a district, you probably had no more than three top performers. You had a core group of people that were in the middle, and they got individual time. So what
Mm.
happened at the end of the year when we do performance management, we spent not only time with my people, I had spent time with other people's people, and had some very, had an ideal of, from a rating perspective, is this number, this number. And we could talk about what do we need to do to move this person forward. So we were in a region that was, I think at the time we were 7 out of 7, and we ended up moving. We ended up being 2 out of 7, and part of that was because of the focus on the middle performer with sales, their performance. I can't tell you how many 5-page business plans we would do on a regular basis, and critically looking at each individual person, what their previous 3 years of performance was, what you needed or what you thought that you needed to do to move that person to the next level. And then my manager would dig into your field coaching reports to see if what you said was what you had written in the field coaching reports, to see if there was alignment.
Yeah.
So when we talk about that level of focus, those are the things that more so did more to moving a region to 2 of 7 than spending time with top performers. Everybody got some love, and so I think that's the opportunity. Oftentimes the difference in coaching is that with an A, you can say do X, do more programs, or
Mm.
do this close differently, or say this, and they get it. With a B, you have to be more explicit during that conversation and that coaching to say exactly what you mean and describe what that means.
Yeah.
I believe I think it's McKinsey. There's a McKinsey article, and it talks about coaching to best practices within an organization. So that's the piece that managers oftentimes will miss.
Mm.
Here are things that other teams or other folks are doing within the team that are moving, and then coaching to that, but also coaching specifically to what that person needs. And my philosophy as a manager has always been, My role as a manager is help you be the best version of you possibly. So you might be very, very different than I am. You might be, let's say you're highly analytical. Well, my
Mm,
goal is help you be more analytical. If the other person on the team is a high I, my goal is to help you be more effective in that way. Now, are there some
yeah.
other things you still got to be able to do analytics and some other things? Do you have to mitigate some weaknesses? Sure, but you have to help people leverage those inherent strengths instead of trying to make them a mini me. As,
Mm.
as I always say, if I had a team of me's, we'd be in big trouble.
Well, that's another lesson as well, because so many sales leaders build teams very much similar to themselves, and they wonder why they're not generating extraordinary results. So when you think about 60 to 70% of the sales force being in the mid tier, um, my experience is often the sales leader doesn't necessarily know how to unlock the potential of those. So you mentioned before, you might have some who are highly analytical. You might have some who are high eyes. For those on the disc, that's the influencer on the disc profile. So very high level, very entrepreneurial thinkers, pioneer type people. Um, how do we unlock the potential of these people, right? So and if you think about it, it represents a large part of the, I guess, the sales opportunity and the revenue base. Because sometimes sales leaders might look at it and say, well, as you said before, a core performer might be actually on target, if not above target, and they think, well, I'm not sure there's much else I can help them with, right? How do we help to unlock this? Because that is probably the difference, could make all the difference in terms of how a whole territory achieves and sets them up for long-term sustainable success.
I think the first thing is it starts with the leader themselves. They have to think about how they're approaching people. There's a whole story around Pygmalion. I don't know if you heard the story about teacher. They gave, they had all of these numbers. They told the teacher that these were the people's IQs. And at the end of the year, these students had all performed very well. And somebody came and said, "Wow, how did these students have never performed this
Mm.
high?" And so the teacher said, "Well, gave me all of these students with these high IQs and found out that the IQs were actually their locker numbers." So part of it is people respond to how you treat them. So
Yeah.
if you treat them in such a way that's really what they do. I was talking to a manager, we were having a conversation, and they were trying to get this representative to increase the number of calls that they were making a day. And so they made a comment and they said the representative had a really good week last week. And I asked the manager, I said, "Well, did you say anything to the representative about it?" And they stopped and they looked at me like I was crazy. And it's like, yeah, you want them to do X, you want them to see more physicians during the week. They had a good week. Why don't you
Mm,
reinforce that with positive reinforcement?
mm,
So a lot of times, some of the obvious things managers just don't do. The other part of that is the conversation that the manager thinks they're having, they don't have. So
yeah.
they have challenges and issues with the representative, and then you ask the question, well, does the rep know? And the manager assumes that they know, or during the
Mm,
coaching, or if you role play a situation with a manager about one of the direct reports or somebody on their team, and everybody's listening, and then you ask everybody else on the team, and you say, "Well, are you clear about what's being coached?" And
yeah.
everybody shakes their head up and down and says, "Well, no." So one of the things is that in any coaching conversation that you're having, you need to anchor that conversation. In other words, here's what we're going to talk about. And then at some point, you've got to, you and that representative need to agree that it's an issue. Because if you can't agree that it's an issue, there's no way you're going to be able to solve it. What a lot of
Mm,
managers do is they jump to action and they try to get the representative to do something that the rep, they're not even sure why we're even having a conversation, let alone know what even the problem is. At least if you can agree that it's a problem and it needs to be fixed, and then you can begin to establish how to go about fixing that. And so
mm,
one of the challenges just gets down to the whole coaching conversation. And I referenced the grow model earlier. Managers have been trained to ask a lot of questions. Well, questions are important, just like they are in sales, they're important in coaching. But if you've been around, you have a lot of experience. you have a point of view. You have an observation. You're working with a lot of representatives in the field, so you see things, and so
Mm,
you give your point of view. You provide the
mm,
data, you provide the information that says, here's why I think that, and then ask, hey, what do you think? And then you get your point, then you get their point of view, and then you can have a discussion. At
yeah.
least you're moving forward, and then understanding that coaching may not happen all in one session. It may take you a couple of sessions to get them to agree that this is a challenge, this is an issue, this is something that we need to solve. But
Mm,
oftentimes, what happens is because the manager jumps to, action. Let's say, for example, they think the representative needs to close. They haven't given them any data or information or anything that leads the representatives to even know or understand. And they may not even be clear because it may sound like, I need to ask more effective probing questions or whatever that is. And then the next time the next field ride comes along, nothing's changed, nothing's happened. There's been no check-in, there's been no accountability call.
yeah.
So that happens on a regular basis. And oh, by the way, when the leaderboard comes, no one's cheering for me because all my stuff's in the middle. Yeah, I had more calls than I had last week. No one reinforces that behavior. All the people that are getting a love are at the top. And then if I'm at the bottom, I'm probably getting a nasty phone call that says, hey, what's going on? I looked at your
Yeah.
numbers and they really stink.
Yeah.
And so I'm left to my own devices. So I think if managers would think more positively. And one other thing, Darren, because I saw this, we were doing this with another group of managers. It wasn't a sales team, but it was a similar type of situation where we were talking about we had done case studies, and you would have thought we were talking about C performers
Yeah.
because the senior manager kind of made a statement of, well, we need to try to get rid of this person. And it was, well, with most of the physicians that they're working with, they're doing a good job. There's a couple that they struggle with, but you've deemed that maybe you should get rid of them. Now, ironically, this person ended up leaving the company. So I think
Okay.
about the time that it takes you to train somebody up and all of those things. This was a solid citizen and this is a solid performer. So when I talk about Pygmalion, their
Mm,
managers, they look at their B performers like they're C's.
yeah.
And then they wonder why that they are not getting as much out of them because ultimately it's you really don't care about me. You just are concerned about me hitting that number. If I don't hit that number, you can get rid of me as soon as I can. There's a lack of trust there. And so
Yeah.
those are all the things that go into that impact the middle performer and why middle performers oftentimes don't thrive within organizations.
And there's an important point you made just before, Keith. You're saying that we've got to be really clear on the problem. And I just wanted to, I guess, clarify that a little bit because sometimes when people hear that, they think, oh, it presupposes there's something wrong. Well, the problem is you might have a middle performer that is on or above target, but we look at them and say, probably they have more potential they can be giving, right? How do I extract that extra 5-10% out of them to take them to a potentially an A performer? So it's not that they're doing things wrong. We're just looking at them and saying they've got more that they could be doing, right? So that's the problem part that we need to be looking at. And the other part with all that is we've got to, as leaders, spend more time with the middle performers because if that represents 60 to 70% of our sales team in terms of our performance, if we just make a quick 5 to 10% improvement, then that can have a huge impact on our end of year performance, not to mention the level of engagement that those mid performers have, because all of a sudden we're now measuring them on behaviors and checking in on those behaviors, not just looking at their results. And so if we just look at the results, and this it's easy to do because at the end of the quarter it tells us whether we're where we sit on
Yeah,
the scoreboard, right? But we have to
exactly.
look
It is.
beyond that and say, well, how can I help this person? Because if I see this person who's a middle performer, a B performer, as an A and I start to treat them as an A, then funnily enough, at some point in the near not too distant future, they'll start to become an A if they
Yeah.
if they take on board the coaching and all that sort of stuff. So I just wanted to clarify that because there might be people listening to this, oh, I've got to find a problem with people. No, no, we've got
Yeah.
the good people.
Some of it's just being more of a cheerleader for your middle performers
Mm,
and just acknowledging the work and effort that they're putting in. It's knowing that somebody cares. And I think part of it also is, Darren, is having real conversations. I remember I had a representative that wasn't closing. And I remember saying to him, I said, you've been doing this job for a long time. I know you know how to close. Why don't you close?
Yeah.
And so he explains to me that he likes to know. It was a congruency issue because in his mind, he said, I like to know more about things. I don't like to be closed when I go somewhere and I'm, going to, and so he said that I like to know more about what somebody's trying to sell me than they do. So
Yeah.
I can come to that decision on my own. So at the time, I think they were looking at getting married. And so I had a whole conversation about, I used the example when I bought my wife an anniversary ring. And I said, we went to all of these stores and my wife wanted white gold. And we looked at all of these rings and I said, all of the rings were pretty much the same.
Yeah.
And I said that the last salesperson, she says to me, she says, will you be taking that ring today? I stopped in my tracks and I could not find one reason to say no because my wife wanted that ring. The price point, it was more than I wanted to spend, but it was a good price point. And then and the conversation we had is I said what I needed from the salesperson was I needed for them to sit with me. In other words, we weren't sitting this way, we were sitting together and they were helping me make a decision that I wanted to make, but I needed somebody to push me over. And
Yeah.
so the conversation was around when you don't sit next to the physician or the healthcare professional and help them make that decision that they want to make that decision, then in essence you're actually failing them. And so he got that.
Yeah.
And so I could have done, the standard, hey, I want you to work on your closing or anything, but there clearly was something that went behind that. And so sometimes when we're having conversations with people, you got to go beyond just following the model and just checking the box, you're not doing this, you're not doing that, but really
Yeah.
trying to understand what is it, because I know you have the capability to do that. I've seen you do it, you're just not doing it. Kind of help me out here, let's have a conversation. and it,
Totally.
and it wasn't something that it wasn't negative, it was just what it was.
Yeah. And the only way you can do that is to actually spend time with them to observe them.
Right.
And this
Yes.
is this is the other thing. So when we're talking about the coaching, the development, unlocking and unleashing the potential of our sales teams, the only way you can do that is to actually spend time with them in the field to see what they do, what they don't do, to provide them feedback, provide them coaching so they can improve, so they can get better, so they can take their performance from a B to an A to an A plus, C to a B. Because the thing I want people to understand is sales leaders are not there and not are seeking to get rid of people. What they want to do is they try to unleash the entire potential of the entire team, collectively and individually. And the only way to do that is to build trusted relationships with the people where they know you're there to serve them. You're not there to criticize them. But the only way to do that is to build that relationship, which is a trusted relationship, which we've spoken of.
Amen.
So, so with that, and I'm conscious of time because it's nearly 10 o'clock at night. Where you are. Um, so for people who want to learn more about you, Keith, and the work that you do, and maybe understand some of the programs you offer, where's the best place for them to do that?
Go to my website, coremanagementtraining.com, and it's all one word, core management training. It's two T's. If you spell it out, go to my
Yep,
website. You can connect with me on LinkedIn under Keith Willis, and you'll see my picture in core management training and connect with me there. Those are the best two places to connect with me.
brilliant, brilliant. And if there was one lasting leaving piece of counsel or advice for sales leaders who perhaps on listening to this are reflecting on the fact that perhaps they haven't been spending enough time with their mid performers, what would be the piece of advice you would give to them?
Yeah, I would say that communication is key. I realize that sales managers are just stretched.
Yeah,
The amount of field time that they're spending now is less than it's ever been because of just the expectations, reports, and all the things that they have to do. Pick up the phone sometimes.
yeah,
Having a 5 or 10 minute conversation. Some sales leaders don't do one-on-ones, at least in pharma, traditionally have, and everything's revolved around the work session. But just pick up the phone, talk to people, tell
Mm.
them you care about them. And I know everybody's not warm and fuzzy and all that other good stuff, but when you pick up the phone, it does show that you care just to check in. And I know one of the lessons I learned as a manager is that sometimes when you pick up the phone and talk to the person that you least expect wants to talk to you, they have questions. And it's like, wow, I'm glad I spent my office day calling all my representatives just to check in.
Yeah.
It's just valuable. If you just did that, uh, I think that there would be great returns for you in and your team as well as your relationships.
Yeah. Love that. Love that. And the thing is, it's easy to do, but it's also easy not to do when a sales
Yes.
leader thinks, oh, I've got to get this report from my sales director. I've got to do my strategic forecast for the next quarter. Do your team a favor and plug into them and give the gift of your attention to them. Keith, hey, thank you so much. It's been a great conversation. I love the insights, and I think we're both on the same page as it relates to sales leadership, irrespective of the industry. The core principles apply. So, I want to thank you for jumping on at such a late time in the evening in Philadelphia. So, and thanks for being a great guest on the Exceptional Sales Leader podcast.
Thank you so much, Darren. Appreciate you having me on.
Awesome, mate.
Well, welcome to today's Lunch and Learn for Leaders and those who want to be. I'm super excited about our gathering today. Of course, we meet every Thursday on Zoom, and it's an opportunity for us to talk about current leadership issues, what might be challenges that you're currently experiencing, or just on a topic that's going to help us be a better leader. And from time to time, I like to bring in a guest. And so I'm super excited to have Keith Willis here with us today. Keith and I met through another introduction and we hit it off, and I was like, man, this guy, he's got it. He knows what it is about being a great leader. And so I invited him to come and be a part of our gathering today. Keith, thank you so much for joining us.
Jill, thank you for having me on.
Yeah. So Keith, just so that people get to know a little bit more about you before we start talking, tell me and tell us, what's your background?
So I own a company, Core Management Training, focused on leadership development training, primarily in the life sciences arena. I started my career in the Army, did ROTC, all that other good stuff. I was a captain when I got out, and then promptly got into the pharmaceutical industry. Worked for several different companies, worked at Ciba-Geigy initially in Albuquerque, New Mexico, and basically moved from west to east. After Ciba downsized, ended up at J&J in the Toledo area where I was a sales rep, hospital rep, and then went into the home office basically in the New Jersey area where I did sales training. And then I was a district sales manager for about 6 years. And then from there, I went over to Wyeth where I did account management training. And then I was the director of field operations for one of the zone VPs. Went back into training after we were bought by Pfizer, and I did vaccines training for a couple of years. And then from there, went over to Otska, where I had opportunity to build out leadership capabilities and leadership development department for that company. They were taking on responsibility for a multi-billion-dollar drug at that time. It was the most written product in industry. And because they were taking over responsibility for their own drug, we had to build out infrastructure. And then from there, I went over to Bristol Myers Squibb, where I ran one of the training teams with about 70 managers, 700 sales representatives. So between being in the military as well as my time in pharma, I've seen a lot of different things when it comes to the leadership.
Yeah, good and bad, I'm sure.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah. Well, let's go ahead and just jump right in. And I'm going to ask the question, what has been your biggest obstacle and how did you overcome it on your leadership journey?
Yeah, so I think one of the biggest challenges that I've had, and I think a lot of leaders have, is around managing yourself. There are a whole constellation of things that go along with that. I think of it as part of it's emotional intelligence, how you're being seen. Are you being not only being an authentic leader, but also are you acting in a way that's the most appropriate? I remember one time my wife had told me that she would never want to work for me. So when your spouse tells you that, that gets your attention. So
Sure.
I look back on my journey. There are things that I did when I was in the military that, you know, they just were not, they just were not good. And so you kind of think about that journey. I mean, I think one of the fortunate things, at least in pharmaceuticals, there's always been a lot of training. And so learning how to do certain types of things. So there are certain leadership things that I did well, you know, innovation, doing things differently, some cases, you know, being one-on-one, those type of things. But I think as you begin to mature, as you get older and reflect upon your behaviors and things that get in the way of being the most effective leader, they can really make a big difference. So for me, that was probably, I would probably say, the biggest obstacle. And I think a lot of people have that obstacle because in your mind, you're doing all the right things. So as a sales manager, you live and die by the numbers. Well,
Sure.
you got to be the one that's calm, cool, and collected, even though you may feel that anxiety. So people pick up on your anxiety. They pick up on the challenges and issues that you have. And so your team becomes a reflection of you. So building those type of skill sets, you become more effective at being able to manage people more effectively. So over the years, I was able to do that. I do know one tool that helped me out significantly was embracing strength finders.
Yeah.
You know, I've been part of it's my personality, could be overly critical, but
Yeah.
beginning to understand how to manage people from a strengths perspective really made all the difference in the world. Now, I wish I could tell you that I read Break All the Rules by Marcus Buckingham, so that was the book kind of turned the corner. But I wouldn't say that it was all of a sudden. It was one of those things where it's like, oh, those are some good concepts. Started to apply them, and I think that's the other thing. A lot of times in your leadership journey, there's kind of a trial and error part of that, and you try some things and then you get away from it and then you try it again. So you have to keep on trying and keep on growing. So when I became a manager working in the home office within training teams, I found that utilizing strengths really made a big difference. I was able to get people promoted. I turned my training team over twice because of utilizing strengths and really begin to understand who I was and how to utilize my best strengths to get the best out of my people and help them do the same thing. So those are a couple of ways that I overcame one of those obstacles. But I do think that managing yourself is one of those things that's easy to, I don't know if avoid is the right word. I think it's part of it's a level of self-awareness.
Yeah.
It's also getting feedback and being open to receiving the feedback that you receive, because a lot of times we can get upset when we hear certain things, or lack of acceptance might be a better word. So sometimes you are good at acknowledging it, but not really good at accepting that's the feedback that you received. And there's some skills that you need to be better at.
Yeah. That's so good. Oh, there's so many thoughts and so many ideas in my head. It's so, I was actually just talking with a friend of mine about this morning. Both he and I come from the pastor world and really got into coaching because there was an opportunity. My particular denomination was looking for people who would get certified as coaches so that then they could go out and coach pastors. Well, we got certified. It was phenomenal. We were super excited. And all the pastors were like, we don't want your help. You know, we don't need you. And finding that it's kind of the same thing now. Like, as I'm building a coaching business, going out and meeting with people and finding out what's going on with their company, they're like, oh yeah, what you're doing, it's so important, but they then don't engage and don't want the service because what I think is there's this fear that they're going to discover that they're the problem. And I just want to tell them, I was like, I think I'm going to work on figuring out how to include this in the conversation. You are the problem. You are the problem. Have the self-awareness to recognize you are the problem and you can grow. So self-awareness and having that growth mindset is so important.
Oh, definitely.
Yeah. how are you finding that you're able to take your knowledge of the importance of self-awareness and then bring that to the leaders and the people that you're working with today?
I think part of it is being in their shoes. You know, when you talk to clients and potential clients, it's helping, letting them know that you're in the same journey. You know,
Yeah.
a lot of times in the pharmaceutical industry, somebody runs leadership development. So you've had some of the same conversations, issues, don't necessarily have a proverbial seat at the table. You know, some of the same challenges. So I think when I can be in somebody else's shoes, it gives them a level of confidence that we can kind of overcome that. And sometimes, you know, they're in a position where they're working with people at different levels. So oftentimes in training roles, training can be the glue within an organization. People don't oftentimes see it that way. Sometimes they see themselves as order takers. And so it's trying to help them figure out, how do I begin to navigate through, you know, the network, the internal networks, the external networks to do the things that need to be done.
Yeah. So let's talk a little bit more about how self-awareness made you become a better leader. Coming from a military background, and I know that there's been a lot of change in the military, but still there's a lot of top-down leadership methodology in the military. And so you obviously learned how to invest in yourself as a leader, and then how to invest in others. What else did you do as far as, you know, developing that self-awareness and then taking the information to become a better leader?
So I guess I would start with a couple of things, because I think at times when we talk about the military, to some degree, it is a misnomer that it is top down. It is and it isn't. It's not
Okay.
that much different than corporate in some ways. The best leaders that I encountered were those that use their influence, not necessarily their authority. If you had to use your authority, then you really weren't being a good leader. So a lot of times you're working within a team. I mean, you know, my first platoon I had, I don't know, 70 soldiers. You have 4 or 5 squad leaders. You have a platoon sergeant. You know, unfortunately, the lieutenant's the dumbest one in the unit because you know, you've been on active duty a hot second. So you have to learn how to listen, get people's opinions and those type of things. So really starts early, that lesson, and then watching senior leaders, you know, how and when to defer, really listen to the people that are in your command. So that had been my experience. And then I think one of the things that the military does extremely well is, you know, in corporate America or even in business generally, you get promoted and there's no training. You just, hey, you're in charge, you're the manager. Well, I went to 6 months of officer basic course before I went to my first unit. And then mind you, there were 3 or 4 years of ROTC where I went to camp. There were evaluations, assessments. So you learn how to be, you know, an officer. And same thing, those that go to West Point, you know, every summer there's an engagement or something where they're learning how to lead. So it's not like you throw somebody in and then all of a sudden they're learning how to lead. It's constant training. I was joking with somebody the other day and I said, fortunately, the military doesn't treat training like corporate does, because if it did, we would be we'd be in extreme trouble. And so, you know, I began to learn there that leaders read, you know, and are well educated. And then fortunately, you know, I joined the industry. And pharma has its critics and those type of things, but generally you get a lot of training. So a lot of training around soft skills, social styles, DISC, emotional intelligence, crucial conversations, coaching and feedback, how to interview. I mean, the list goes on. And
Sure.
so you're surrounded by a lot of very intelligent, very bright people, and invariably the conversation comes up, what are you reading? So as a consequence of that, that's how you begin to develop a level of self-awareness. And then the other part of that is that it's not necessarily and even if you move from company to company, you get a coaching workshop. And then, I like to think of a bundle. So crucial conversations, that's advanced coaching. You have some other elements that, you can add emotional intelligence, you can add resilience. All of those things help you be able to have different conversations or tough conversations with people. So become a lot more aware of people's responses to you, and it becomes more about them and not you. One of the lessons I learned is my role as a manager, or my role as a leader, is to make you the best version of you. So,
Yes.
if you're able to do that, then you're going to be a lot more effective, because if everybody on my team was just like me, we would be in a world of hurt. There's just some skills that I just don't have. And so you try to build a team that has a lot of those skill sets and brings a lot of things to the table, a lot of different ideals. And that's when we get into those discussions about diversity and things like that. Though that's why those types of things are very important.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, ultimately, that's what leadership is bringing out the best in the people that you lead, not because you were the best at doing the job that they're doing.
Yeah, and sometimes you're managing people that are doing jobs that didn't even exist. So, you think about Drucker, and you think about, his concept around knowledge workers. You can't, I mean, I know we talk a lot about leading by doing and leading by example. I think there are some things that you can do, but I think there are also some things that inherently you have people on your team, you've never done their job, and you're never going to be an expert in doing their job. But there is a way to coach them, be able to provide them with feedback, and help them in a way that they can impact the business in a positive way.
Sure. Yeah. We talked about feedback a few weeks ago, and we started with the fact that it's feedback when I give it, it's criticism when you give it to me. Yeah. How important, what is, like, how do you set up your team and the people that you're training to be good leaders? How do you set them up to receive feedback in a positive way?
I think for starters, you got to do early and often. I was doing a course on psychological safety, going through a trainer, so on and so forth. And somebody had come up with a statistic, 5-to-1, 5 positive to 1. I know Manager Tools, which is a podcast that does a lot of stuff around management. I think there were 7-to-1. So at the end of the day, you should be given feedback a lot, and it's
Sure.
not hard to do. In Manager Tools, they have a comment that if you ask the question, can I give you some feedback? And somebody has that look on your face like, oh crap, then you're not giving enough feedback, because
Right.
mostly it should be positive. And then when you begin to give feedback, people will be looking for feedback. I mean, all you're doing is impacting people's behavior, and the behavior is what that's their performance over time. So if you're not
Right.
providing any feedback at all, you have no impact on their performance. And
Yeah.
and so, managers get confused between the difference between coaching and feedback. I mean, feedback really does not take that long, and it's not rocket science. It's just feedback. And most of the time it's positive. It's like you give a presentation, hey, you did a really good job. Here are the things that you did well. You think you might be able to change this and this because, the impact that it had on the audience or whatever that is. And you can be walking down the hall and give feedback. It's people
Right.
make it a big deal. It's not a big deal. It's just feedback.
Well, for a while, it became such a formalized thing. Like, oh, we've got to sit down. We only give feedback during our one-on-ones, and we schedule those. And it was just so like locked into a box that people lost the natural ability to be able to give feedback.
Yeah, it's like you're working on a project. There are always some elements that you struggle with. it's not any different than having a conversation with your boss about what you're doing, what you're trying to accomplish, and where the hot spots are and where you're frustrated. Have you thought
Yeah.
about X? Have you tried
Yeah.
this? Have you tried that? I mean, that's feedback. I mean, it's not a formal coaching session. All it is, hey, try this instead of that.
Yeah. Well, it's conversation. It's working together.
Exactly.
And so why do we have to define it as being this thing that then becomes processed, that then it loses its impact and becomes just one more thing for somebody to check off a box?
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, it's so good. Oh, dang it, I had a question and just totally left my mind. That's the challenge of live recording. Does anybody else have any questions real quick while I'm trying to bring that question back to my mind?
Yeah, this has been a great conversation. I really appreciate your perspective, Keith. Do you feel like there are any tools that maybe resemble a filter of sort that you kind of, I don't know, put in front of the way, like how you give feedback and when you give feedback, that have been really effective for you, like something you learned over time? Like, a good example would be like the sandwich method of, giving a compliment and then your feedback and then
Yeah, I'm not a sandwich fan.
but something, like that,
Yeah.
so to speak.
I cringe every time I see it in a deck. I do think models are good because they're tools. You only have one tool, you only have one tool. Yeah, more than one tool, you have options. So I would start with that. I think there's situational leadership. I think they have, that model. I think that model works well. I like the manager tools model because what it does is it presents it in a way that almost just like situational leadership tool, but the difference is that you ask if you can give somebody some feedback because sometimes it may not be the right time, so on and so forth. And if you create a culture of feedback, it gets to be simpler. And if most of the time that you're giving feedback, if you start with positive feedback, then people are going to begin to ask. And so if you create that environment, then it becomes easier. When people don't give feedback, then it becomes a big deal. And I think that's the challenge, is to really focus on that. And the same thing with coaching. I think coaching models are good because it's a model. The models vary, they're not that much different, but beginning to start with a model, because the easy coaching is easy. Where it becomes really important is when you need to have those important conversations. Doing things like the other part of that is when you do things like one-on-ones, staff meetings, and those type of things. The reason that you do a one-on-one is not really for the update. It's to build a professional relationship, because at some point you're going to have a conversation. I won't say goes south, but you need to move somebody in a different direction. And so in some cases that could be career changing. I remember somebody that was on my team, they were from another country. And so in their country, their culture was it's in your face. And so when they would engage with people, if they were getting in the way of a project, so on and so forth, it would be this conflict. And it would be conflict that was not seen in a positive way. And so having that conversation was an important conversation, but being able to have a model and starting as a starting point, because it was a crucial conversation. So I'd probably use some crucial conversation pieces. I use some other pieces from other models that I had learned, and you put all of those things together. It didn't change the fact that there were tears. And there were some emotional there were some emotional challenges during that conversation. But when people come back later, years later, and thank you for that conversation, then the models work. And that's the beauty of using these type of models as a starting point. And I would even argue that, yes, I don't like the sandwich But I would say that using the sandwich would be better than not having, let's say you never given feedback before and you don't know what to do and you've got a model to rely upon. I think it's a starting point. I think using some tools is better, is most times better than using no tools at all, because it gives you a starting point and then you learn other stuff that you can add in and then you can pick and choose. There are coaching models I learned probably 20 years ago where there was this thing called the congruency model, for example. And I pulled that tool out when I was having a problem coaching somebody in, like closing, for example. Look, I know you know how to close. You've been doing sales for 20 years. What's the deal?
Yeah.
And so there was a value issue. But if
Yeah.
I had not learned that model, I would have never asked that question. I would have kept coaching the way that I was coaching. But because I pulled something from, another model and used it, we got to the issue and got to the challenge, and we were able to have a conversation. And it wasn't it was never a negative conversation, but it was a factual conversation about how do we move you forward. So I think whether you're doing coaching, you're doing feedback, even if you're doing business planning, I think models are great because they're frameworks. And then from there, you can get creative and all that other good stuff.
Yeah. You know,
Thank you.
Patrick Lencioni, he talks about employee engagement. And one of the things that he said there's 3 pieces. And one of the big pieces is that managers know their people, that they're known. And so if I, as a leader, know my people and have a relationship with them, then when I'm giving feedback, it's going to become, it's going to become more conversational, to where you're not like, okay, did I gave a positive, here's the negative, another positive. Like it just flows so naturally out of the conversations that you're having, and it's received better, for one. I mean, there's times where we just have to give what people would call negative feedback. We have to coach people onto being the best version of themselves. You talked about that earlier, that bringing out the best in people. So if we have a relationship with them, they know that we're not doing it to be mean. We're not doing it to be heavy-handed, but we're doing it because we want to see them be successful, because when they're successful, the company's successful.
Absolutely.
So, yeah.
I mean,
Yeah.
I think that, as a part of that, because in Patrick Lencioni's book, when he talks about that piece there, I think one of the other things that's really telling is the manager, and this is the piece around the leadership piece, I think sometimes that's missing, because it's a great book. And even when you get an Amy Edmondson's piece around psychological safety, at the end of the day, the manager has to have some level of vulnerability, because none of that happens unless the manager signs up for it.
Right.
So it's willing to have the conversation, really get to know people, and for the people to get to know them also.
Right.
One of the lessons I learned, I asked my team, I told my team, I said that I have a tendency to be overly critical. So if you think I'm being overly critical, then you need to raise your hand. You need to tell me that, because it's who I am. It's personality flaw, or whatever you want to call it. And so that opened up the lines of communication, because it was, acknowledgement of, look, I got gaps just like everybody else does.
Right.
Have a real conversation with me about how you're feeling. And so I think those things get to be really important. And I think that's the base leadership that everybody can have, whether you're a leader in that you lead leaders, or you're an individual contributor and a leader in being willing to be vulnerable, to have the conversations that you need to move people, not only to move people forward, but to move yourself forward.
Yeah. Well, Keith, thank you so much for your time today. This has been great. We'll have to definitely have you come back and share some more. Where can people find you?
So yes, you can find me at coremanagementtraining.com. It's exactly how it sounds. If you spell all the words out, so it's literally 2 T's, because when core management ends with a T and then there's a training. So that's my website, or you can get me at kwillis@coremanagementtraining.com.
All right. Awesome. Well, thank you again so much for joining us today, and thanks everybody for being here. Of course, quick announcement. We will not be meeting next week because I'm doing a presentation and it's smack in the same time. So next week will be canceled, unfortunately. I don't like to do that, but it couldn't be avoided. But we record these, they're up on YouTube. It's a great opportunity. You can go back and watch maybe some previous episodes, kind of brush up on some of the leadership stuff we've been talking about. If there's ever any way I can be a resource for you, you can reach me at jvaldez@linkconsulting.info. If you go to linkconsulting.info, there will be a pop-up that comes up, and I have a free gift for anybody who goes there. It's a little ebook called Confident Leadership: How to Be a Confident Leader of a Committed Team Providing Stellar Service. And I would love to be able to give that gift to you. And until 2 weeks from now, thanks for joining us and have a great rest of your day. Bye.
Thank you so much.
Thank you all. Thank you, Keith.
Thank you.
Thanks. Appreciate it.